The year is 1814. For the past 2 years, the United States has been in an ongoing war against the British Empire, and it has been going nowhere. Not only has no territory been gained in this war, but the British had also sacked the White House, and by September, both sides were ready to negotiate peace. However, the British were still unsure whether the Americans were going to ratify the peace agreements, and still made plans to continue the war and further weaken American resolve. But rather than continue the war in the Chesapeake Bay, the British set their sights on the Crescent City of New Orleans. This was the final act of the War of 1812. This was the Battle of New Orleans. New Orleans was a relatively new addition to the Union compared to many of the other major American cities at the time. The U.S. bought New Orleans along with the rest of the Louisiana Territory from the French in 1803, doubling the size of the country. However, while the U.S. owned all that land, it was very hard for the U.S. to access all that land. The Appalachian Mountains, which divided the country, made it very difficult for people to travel back and forth. The only way for Americans to reach the new territory was to travel south to New Orleans before moving up to the Mississippi River. This made New Orleans a very important city for the United States, as it was essentially the gateway into the new territory, with all its land and resources good for agriculture. And the British were aware of that. They knew that if they could take New Orleans, they could force the Americans to give up Louisiana altogether, all 530 million acres. In late December 1814, 1,600 soldiers under British General John Keane stationed themselves on an island 30 miles east of New Orleans. Now, there were various routes Keane could have taken to get to New Orleans, each with their own benefits and downsides. But the one they ended up going with was this route, basically going through some bayous before finally disembarking a few miles south of the river from the city. It wasn't the best position, but it did put them in a spot that couldn't be easily defended by the Americans, so they decided to go with it. And on the morning of December 23, 1814, the British seized the home of U.S. Major Gabriel Villaire before stationing themselves in his plantation. Now, things were looking pretty good for the British if it weren't for one tiny, itty-bitty little oversight on their part. Villaire had escaped and was able to warn the Americans in New Orleans about their positions. With the British's locations revealed, it was up to the Americans, and more specifically, General Andrew Jackson, to plan their next move. Jackson had known the British were planning to attack New Orleans for quite some time now. In the end, there were more than 4,000 men who came to aid in defending New Orleans. This included people from all walks of life, from aristocrats to commoners to pirates. Wait, pirates? Yep. Now, this wasn't the first time the Americans had worked with pirates. Back in the American Revolution, a naval officer loyal to the US named John Paul Jones had ransacked towns across the British Isles. He was America's first pirate. But by the War of 1812, the American government collaborated with quite a few pirates in the area. Notable names of these pirates were Jean and Pierre Lafitte. No one exactly knows where they came from, but what we do know is that for the past few years, the two brothers have been a part of a smuggling business in the New Orleans area, with their main location being Barataria Bay, just 40 miles south of New Orleans. By the start of the war, the two brothers were thriving, with 3 ships to boot. Now, shortly thereafter, the British had a blockade on the entire length of the American coast. This was a problem for the US as they desperately needed supplies. After all, if you want to win a war, you need the resources in order to fight that war. As such, the Americans sent letters of marque to many private vessels. These letters were basically a government license that basically said, "Hello, I know you guys like to seize and smuggle goods for your own benefits, and you guys are great at it, but what if you guys helped us by seizing and smuggling goods for us? You guys won't get in trouble, and you might end up getting to keep some of the spoils." So many of these pirates, now privateers for the US government, would seize British ships and hand the Americans the needed supplies. Over 500 of these ships aided the US during the War of 1812. Now, the British did try to get some pirates on their side. In September 1814, the British asked the Lafitte brothers to aid in their attack against the Americans in New Orleans. Not only did they refuse, this backfired so hard when the Lafitte brothers ended up telling the Americans of the upcoming attack. which was how Jackson found out about it, though after some skepticism. Now, why would the pirates be willing to help the Americans and not the British? Well, there's a good reason for it. For one, while many of these pirates were, well, pirates and therefore criminals, they were still loyal to the United States. These pirates also really didn't like the idea of Britain getting up in all their business. And in the case of John and Pierre, they hoped to receive government pardons for their help in the war. So, for the past month, Jackson had been in New Orleans strengthening the city's defenses, and at the same time, Jean and Pierre Lafitte had been keeping an eye on the British's movements, and he ended up confirming to Jackson what Belair had said. So in light of this new information, Jackson and his 2,000 men went south to attack the British at their encampment. It wasn't enough for them to leave, but it did weaken them enough to give the Americans some time to set up earthworks around the river. A few more skirmishes happened here and there, but it wouldn't be until the 8th of January 1815 did the battle truly commence. So the British plan was essentially this: go for the American battery guns stationed on the other side of the river, turn those attacks toward the American line before attacking head-on. Already at the start of the battle, the British already got a rough start as their reinforcements would end up arriving late. Meanwhile, on the left bank, a heavy fog had set in, making it hard to see anyone. This did give the British some edge as it allowed the British to get closer to the American line. But as soon as the fog faded, the British faced heavy American fire. Many of the British senior officers were gunned down by Jackson's men. And remember when I said the reinforcements were running late? Well, this created a lot of discoordination. The British gave it their all to break the American line, but it was simply impossible. The Americans then pushed forward, and at that point, with all the British leadership either being dead or heavily wounded, the British had to fall back. With the left bank dealt with, the Americans were able to push back the British forces on the right bank, who had started their attack much later than anticipated. And by the afternoon, the battle was over. The battle would end up sending American morale to an all-time high, along with the news of the war's end. The battle had also boosted Andrew Jackson's popularity, setting him down his path to the White House 2 decades later. For Jean and Pierre Lafitte, as promised, they were given pardons for their smuggling charges. And as for British and American relations, the end of the war had basically resolved most of the issues that had existed since the end of the American Revolution, hence the reason why this war is called the Second War of Independence. But if you want to know more about those issues and the War of 1812 as a whole, stay tuned next week when I release the full video on the War of 1812. Think of this video as a preview of what's to come. Prepare for more basically history videos on the way. Anyway, that's it from me. Thanks for watching. Bye!